The morning air bit at Nina Patel's exposed cheeks as she adjusted her backpack straps, the weight of 3 days' worth of supplies settling against her shoulders. At 26, she had hiked countless trails across the United States, but the Wind River Range in Wyoming held a special allure she couldn't resist. The jagged peaks stretched toward a cloudless blue sky, their granite faces catching the early sunlight and turning it to gold. Nina checked her watch. 6:15 a.m. Perfect. Timing to begin the 12-mile trek to Titcomb Basin. "You all set?" asked the ranger at the Elkhart Park trailhead station, a weathered man in his 50s with deep smile lines and a name tag that read, Roberts. Nina nodded, handing over her wilderness permit. "All set. Planning to camp near Island Lake tonight, then head into the basin tomorrow." Ranger Roberts studied her permit and made a notation on his clipboard. "Traveling alone?" "Yes, sir." Nina was used to this question and the look of concern that inevitably followed. Solo female hikers still raised eyebrows, even among experienced outdoorsmen. "Been up this way before?" "Twice, but not for a few years." The ranger handed back her permit. "Well, we've had increased grizzly activity this season. So with 2 cubs was spotted near Seneca Lake 3 days ago." He pulled a pamphlet from beneath his clipboard. "Make sure you're bear aware. Store your food properly, carry spray, and make noise on the trail." Nina patted the canister of bear spray holstered to her hip. "Always do. I've got a bear barrel. For food, too." Ranger Roberts seemed satisfied. "Good. Cell service is non-existent past the 1st mile, so your emergency beacon is your lifeline if something goes wrong." He gestured toward the small device clipped to her backpack strap. "Weather looks clear today, but we're expecting some wind tomorrow afternoon. Not enough to worry about, just be prepared." Nina thanked him and signed the trailhead registry, noting the time and her expected return in 3 days. Only one other party had signed in that morning. A group of 4 headed towards Seneca Lake. The mountains would be relatively quiet this late in September, just the way she liked them. The first miles disappeared beneath her boots as Nina fell into a comfortable rhythm. Her life back in Portland seemed impossibly distant now. The software development job, the cramped apartment, the endless Zoom calls. Out here, existence simplified to its essential elements: movement, sustenance, shelter. Her therapist had suggested this solo trip might provide clarity about whether to accept the lucrative job offer in Chicago. The corporate position would mean a substantial pay increase, but would also anchor her to a city far from any real wilderness. Nina had postponed the decision until after this trip, hoping the mountains would provide the answer. Sunlight filtered through the lodgepole pines as the trail gradually climbed in elevation. Nina paused occasionally to drink water and adjust her trekking poles. The forest here teemed with life. Chickadees flitted between branches, and once a mule deer watched her pass with calm curiosity before bounding away. Nina maintained a steady pace but took care to make noise, occasionally calling out "Hey bear" at blind corners and dense thickets just as she'd been taught. By noon, she had reached Photographer's Point, a stunning overlook that provided the first real glimpse of the Wind River Range in all its glory. Massive granite peaks rose from emerald forests, their summits still holding patches of snow despite the late summer heat. Nina removed her pack and sat on a sun-warmed boulder, pulling out her lunch, a tortilla wrap with tuna, a handful of trail mix, and an apple. As she ate, she scanned the vista with her binoculars, picking out the route she would follow for the rest of the day. The solitude was therapeutic. No emails to answer, no deadlines to meet, no social obligations to fulfill. Just Nina and the mountains, existing together in a silence broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional cry of a soaring hawk. This was what she feared losing most if she took the Chicago position, these moments of perfect isolation and communion with wilderness. After lunch, Nina continued her ascent. The trail steepened as it approached Hobbs Lake, her quadriceps burning pleasantly with exertion. She passed a couple heading down, the only hikers she'd encountered all day, and exchanged brief trail reports. They mentioned seeing fresh bear scat near Seneca Lake, but no actual sightings. "Just stay alert," the man advised, adjusting his worn Tilly hat. "The grizzlies have been pushing farther south each year." Nina thanked them and continued upward, her senses slightly heightened. Despite years of backcountry experience, she maintained a healthy respect for grizzlies. Unlike black bears, which typically fled from human presence, grizzlies could be unpredictable and territorial. Nina checked her bear spray, ensuring it was accessible, and continued her occasional calls as she hiked. The afternoon stretched on, shadows lengthening as the sun arced westward. Nina reached Seneca Lake by 4 o'clock, its sapphire waters reflecting the surrounding peaks in perfect symmetry. She paused to filter water and rest before the final push to Island Lake, where she planned to make camp. The ranger's warning about increased bear activity lingered in her mind, prompting her to scan the shoreline carefully before proceeding. Nina saw nothing concerning and continued along the trail that skirted Seneca's eastern shore. The path narrowed in places, cutting through thickets of willows where visibility diminished. She called out more frequently here, her voice seeming small against the vastness of the landscape. A light breeze carried the scent of pine and the earthy aroma of warming soil. Everything appeared peaceful, but Nina couldn't shake a growing sense of unease that prickled along her spine. When she found the bear scat on the trail, Nina stopped immediately. It was fresh, still moist and steaming slightly in the cooling air. Large, filled with partially digested berries and what looked like fur, the distinctive scat of a grizzly. Her pulse quickened as she scanned her surroundings with newfound intensity. The trail ahead curved through a dense stand of willows, creating a blind corner that suddenly seemed ominous. Nina unholstered her bear spray and removed the safety clip. Standard procedure would be to make noise before proceeding, alerting any nearby bears to her presence. They typically avoided humans when given the chance. "Hey, bear!" she called loudly, clacking her trekking poles together. "Coming through!" She waited 30 seconds, listening for any response. The crash of an animal moving away, the distinctive huff of a startled bear. Nothing but silence greeted her. Nina called again, louder this time, her voice echoing off the nearby rock face. Still nothing. Following protocol, she proceeded cautiously, making noise with every step. The sun had dipped behind the western peaks now, casting the trail in deep shadow. Island Lake was less than a mile ahead, and Nina was eager to reach it before full darkness descended. She rounded the blind corner slowly, trekking poles extended forward, bear spray in her right hand. The attack happened with a speed that defied Nina's comprehension. One moment the trail was empty, the next filled with fur and fury. 850 pounds of grizzly bear charging from a willow thicket not 10 yards away. Nina had no time to deploy her spray before the bear was upon her, its momentum knocking her backward with terrifying force. Her backpack absorbed some of the initial impact as she fell, the bear's massive paws swiping at her torso. A searing pain erupted across Nina's side as claws tore through her jacket and into flesh. The world narrowed to teeth and fur and the hot, fishy breath of the bear as it roared inches from her face. Training kicked in through the fog of terror. Nina curled into a ball, lacing her fingers behind her neck, elbows protecting her face. She forced her body to go limp, despite every instinct, screaming to fight or flee. Playing dead. The only strategy, when a grizzly attack was defensive rather than predatory. The bear's weight pressed down on her, crushing her against the rocky trail. Nina felt a distinct crack as ribs gave way beneath the pressure, sending fresh waves of agony through her body. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood. The bear's jaw closed around her backpack, teeth puncturing the fabric with frightening ease, missing her shoulder by inches. Time dissolved into a series of terrifying sensations, the bear's claws raking across her thigh, its massive head butting against her protected neck, hot saliva dripping onto her cheek. Nina maintained the death-like stillness despite the excruciating pain, knowing that any movement could trigger a renewed attack. After what seemed an eternity but was likely less than 2 minutes, the assault paused. Nina felt the bear step back, huffing loudly. She remained motionless, eyes squeezed shut, breath held despite the fire in her lungs. The bear circled her prone form, occasionally nudging her with its snout. Nina could smell its wild musk, hear the snuffling as it investigated her seemingly lifeless body. A low growl rumbled from the bear's throat as it circled once more. Then, to Nina's immense relief, she heard the sound of the animal moving away, branches breaking as it pushed through undergrowth. Still, she didn't move. Experienced hikers knew that bears sometimes watched from a distance to see if their victims stirred. 1 minute passed, 2, 5. Each second an agonizing test of endurance as pain radiated from her ribs and the claw wounds across her side and thigh. Nina's lungs burned for air, but she limited herself to shallow breaths, maintaining the illusion of death. Blood trickled warm and wet along her side, soaking into her thermal base layer. At 8 minutes, Nina finally allowed herself to open one eye a sliver. The trail before her was empty. Gathering every ounce of courage, she slowly turned her head to scan her surroundings. No sign of the bear. Only then did she permit herself a full, shuddering breath that sent daggers of pain through her chest. "Shit," she whispered, the simple word carrying all the terror and relief of her survival. Nina remained prone for another full minute, listening intently for any sound of the bear's return. Hearing nothing but the normal sounds of the wilderness, she finally attempted to move. Each slight shift sent fresh waves of agony radiating from her ribs. Her thermal shirt clung to her side, wet with blood where the bear's claws had torn through. With excruciating slowness, Nina rolled onto her back, gasping as the movement pulled at her wounds. The darkening sky spun above her as shock threatened to overtake her senses. She forced herself to focus, to assess her situation with as much clinical detachment as possible. She was injured, alone, miles from help, in grisly territory, with darkness approaching. The situation couldn't be much worse. Nina fumbled for the emergency beacon clipped to her backpack strap, thanking whatever impulse had led her to place it there rather than in an outer pocket. Her fingers trembled as she flipped open the protective cover and pressed the SOS button. A small LED began blinking, indicating the distress signal was transmitting. Now she had to survive until help arrived. Using her trekking poles for support, Nina managed to push herself into a sitting position. The movement nearly caused her to black out as pain lanced through her broken ribs. She leaned against a nearby boulder, breathing in shallow gasps, waiting for the spinning world to stabilize. Her backpack lay several feet away, partly torn, open by the bear's powerful jaws. The food barrel thankfully remained intact, still secured to the bottom of the pack. Nina knew she couldn't remain on the trail. The bear might return, and the approaching darkness would make it impossible for her to detect its approach. Shelter was her next priority. With her injuries, reaching Island Lake was out of the question, but she remembered passing a backcountry ranger cabin near the southern end of Seneca Lake, perhaps half a mile back the way she had come. The prospect of moving that distance with broken ribs and lacerations seemed nearly impossible, but Nina had no choice. Staying put wasn't an option. Using one trekking pole as a support, she managed to stand, swaying as waves of dizziness and nausea washed over her. She took a moment to steady herself, then carefully retrieved her backpack. The weight of it against her injured ribs brought tears to her eyes, but she couldn't abandon her supplies. "One step at a time," Nina whispered to herself, an old hiking mantra that had served her through difficult trails in the past. The journey back toward Seneca Lake became a blur of pain and determination. Each step jarred her broken ribs, and the claw wounds on her side and thigh burned with increasing intensity. Nina kept her bear spray in hand, constantly scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. Darkness descended rapidly, forcing her to retrieve her headlamp from an accessible pocket. The bobbing circle of light seemed feeble against the enveloping night. What should have been a 30-minute walk stretched to nearly 2 hours of agonizing progress. Twice Nina had to stop and sink to the ground, overwhelmed by pain and dizziness. The second time she vomited bile onto the trail, her body responding to trauma and shock. But each time, after a brief rest, she forced herself to continue, knowing that remaining exposed in bear territory would likely mean death. When the small log structure of the ranger cabin finally appeared in her headlamp beam, Nina could have wept with relief. The cabin was basic, used primarily as an emergency shelter and occasional base for backcountry rangers. She prayed it would be unlocked. The door, thankfully, opened when she turned the handle. Nina stumbled inside, closing and latching the door behind her. The interior was Spartan. A small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a simple bunk with a thin mattress. No electricity, no running water, but it offered 4 walls and a roof between her and the wilderness. Nina collapsed onto the bunk, her backpack sliding to the floor beside her. The simple act of lying down provided such relief that for several minutes she simply breathed, trying to manage the pain that radiated from her injuries. When the initial wave subsided, she forced herself to action. First aid couldn't wait. With trembling hands, Nina retrieved her first aid kit from her pack. The extent of her injuries would require more than the basic supplies she carried, but she could at least clean and dress the wounds to prevent infection. She carefully removed her shredded jacket and thermal shirt, wincing as the fabric pulled away from the congealing blood on her side. 3 parallel. Claw marks ran from just below her sports bra to her hip on the right side, deep enough to need stitches, but not so deep as to damage internal organs, as far as she could tell. Her thigh bore a similar set of lacerations, painful but less severe. The real concern was her ribs. At least 2 were broken on her right side, making every movement and breath an exercise in agony. Using water from her bottle and antiseptic wipes, Nina cleaned the wounds as best she could, gritting her teeth against the stinging pain. She applied antibiotic ointment and covered the lacerations with gauze pads, securing them with medical tape. For her ribs, there was little she could do beyond taking ibuprofen from her kit and trying to move carefully to prevent further damage. The first aid completed, Nina assessed her situation. The emergency beacon would bring help, but in this remote location, rescue might not arrive until morning. She needed to manage until then. The cabin was cold, the September night bringing mountain temperatures down to near freezing. Despite her exhaustion, Nina knew she needed to light the wood stove. Fortunately, the ranger cabin was maintained with emergency supplies. A small stack of split logs sat beside the stove, along with kindling and matches. Moving with agonizing slowness, Nina managed to build and light a fire. The warmth gradually spread through the single-room structure, providing a small measure of comfort. Nina retrieved her sleeping bag from her pack and carefully maneuvered into it on the bunk. The simple act of lying down brought both relief and increased pain as her body settled. She took another dose of ibuprofen, washing it down with small sips of water. The trauma and shock had left her simultaneously exhausted and hyper-alert, her mind racing despite her body's desperate need for rest. Every sound from outside, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional crack of a branch, sent her heart rate spiking. The bear was still out there, perhaps nearby. The sturdy logs of the cabin provided physical security, but psychological safety remained elusive. Nina kept her bear spray within reach beside the bunk, a talisman against the terrors of the night. As she lay in the dimly lit cabin, the reality of her situation fully descended. She had survived a grisly attack, something many victims couldn't claim. The memory of those terrifying moments replayed in her mind with vivid clarity. The sudden appearance of the massive bear, the searing pain of claws rending flesh, the crushing weight against her ribs, the hot breath on her face as she played dead, counting seconds that stretched like hours. 8 minutes. She had maintained perfect stillness for 8 full minutes, while the grizzly investigated her seemingly lifeless body. Those 8 minutes had saved her life, but had also fundamentally altered it in ways Nina was only beginning to comprehend. Something fundamental had shifted within her, a recognition of her own fragility against the raw power of nature. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by pain and the startling clarity of nightmares that merely replayed the actual attack. Each time Nina jerked awake, gasping against the fire in her ribs, momentarily unsure of where she was until the cabin's interior resolved in the dying glow from the wood stove. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness, pale light filtering through the cabin's single window. Nina had survived the night, but her condition had deteriorated. Fever flushed her skin, suggesting the beginning of infection despite her careful cleaning of the wounds. The pain in her ribs had intensified, and the simple act of sitting up required monumental effort. Around mid-morning, Nina heard the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors approaching. The search and rescue team had received her beacon signal. Relief washed over her, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. She managed to stand and move painfully to the cabin door, opening it just as the helicopter circled overhead, spotting the structure in the clearing. Unable to land in the dense forest, the rescue team deployed a medic by hoist near the cabin. The man who jogged toward her wore a bright orange flight suit with search and rescue emblazoned across the back. "Nina Patel," he called as he approached. Nina nodded, leaning heavily against the cabin doorframe for support. "I'm Dave Schultz, Wyoming Search and Rescue. We received your emergency signal." His professional demeanor shifted to concern as he took in her condition. "What happened?" "Grizzly attack," Nina managed, the words feeling surreal as she spoke them. "Yesterday evening, about a mile north of here, on the Island Lake Trail." Dave's expression turned grave as he guided her back inside the cabin. "Let's get you stabilized for transport. The chopper will hoist us out together." The medic's assessment was efficient and thorough. He examined her wounds, took vital signs, and administered pain medication that brought blessed relief within minutes. As he worked, he maintained a steady stream of conversation, partly to distract Nina, partly to assess her mental status. "You did everything right," he told her, as he secured a specialized brace around her torso to stabilize her broken ribs. Playing dead was the correct response to a defensive attack, and making it to shelter probably saved your life, given these temperatures and your injuries. The evacuation procedure passed in a blur for Nina. Dave secured her in a rescue harness, strapped himself to her, and communicated with the helicopter crew via radio. The sensation of being lifted into the air while secured to the medic added a surreal quality to the already dreamlike experience. Within minutes, they were inside the helicopter, rotors thundering as they banked and headed toward Jackson. The hospital in Jackson Hole received trauma cases regularly, everything from skiing accidents to wilderness mishaps, but grisly attack victims remained relatively rare. Nina was met by a trauma team that worked with practiced efficiency. Her wounds were properly cleaned and sutured. Her broken ribs, 3, not 2 as she had estimated, were confirmed by X-ray, and antibiotics were administered intravenously to combat the infection that had already begun to develop. Nina drifted, in and out of consciousness throughout the procedures, the combination of trauma, medication, and exhaustion overwhelming her system. When she finally awoke fully in a private room, evening shadows stretched across the floor, and a nurse was adjusting her IV line. "Welcome back," the nurse said, noticing Nina's open eyes. "You've been in and out for a few hours. How's the pain?" "Managed," Nina replied, her voice raspy from dryness and disuse. The sharp edges of her pain had been dulled to a persistent ache, likely by whatever medication flowed through the IV. "Dr. Mercer will be by shortly to discuss your injuries. In the meantime, there's a ranger waiting to speak with you when you're up to it." The nurse checked Nina's vital signs and made notes on a tablet. "You're quite the talk of the hospital, you know. Grisly attack survivors are part of a pretty exclusive club around here." Nina wasn't sure how to respond to that. The exclusive club had been joined through terror and pain, not achievement. Before she could formulate a reply, the nurse had moved on to adjusting the blinds against the setting sun. "I'll let the ranger know you're awake. He's been very patient." After the nurse left, Nina took stock of her situation. Her torso was wrapped in firm bandaging, and she could feel the pull of sutures along her side and thigh. An IV delivered fluids and medication to her left arm, while her right hand was connected to a pulse oximeter. The hospital room was standard issue: beige walls, sanitized surfaces, the persistent beep of monitoring equipment. Ranger Roberts, the same weathered man who had checked her permit at the trailhead just yesterday morning, appeared in the doorway. The sight of his familiar face provided an unexpected anchor for Nina, connecting her present situation to the routine beginning of her hike. "Ms. Patel," he said, approaching the bed with a mixture of concern and professional distance. "I'm glad to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I lost an argument with a freight train," Nina replied, attempting humor that fell flat even to her own ears. Roberts nodded solemnly. "That's an apt description. The search and rescue team reported your injuries. You're fortunate to be alive." "The bear," Nina began, "is still out there," Roberts confirmed. "That's partly why I'm here. I need to take your statement about the encounter while it's fresh in your memory. This will help us locate and identify the bear and determine if further action is necessary." Nina understood the implications. Grizzlies that attacked humans sometimes had to be euthanized, especially if the attack was predatory rather than defensive. The thought brought complicated emotions. She had no desire for vengeance against an animal acting on instinct, yet she understood the risk management calculations that went into such decisions. With careful prompting from Roberts, Nina recounted the attack in detail. The location, the sudden charge from the willow thicket, the intensity and duration of the attack, and the bear's eventual departure. Roberts took notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. "Based on your description, this sounds like a defensive encounter," he concluded after Nina finished her account. "You surprised each other at close range, and the bear responded defensively. The fact that it left after you played. Dead supports this assessment. If it had been predatory, it likely would have continued the attack or attempted to drag you away." Nina nodded, wincing as the movement sent a twinge through her ribs. "So what happens now?" We'll increase patrols in that area and post warnings. The sow with cubs we mentioned might be the same bear, but we can't know for certain without DNA evidence. Roberts closed his notebook. We've retrieved your backpack and equipment from the cabin. They'll hold it for you at the ranger station when you're discharged. After Roberts left, promising to check on her again before she was released, Nina was visited by Dr. Mercer, a trauma surgeon with a direct manner and kind eyes. 3 broken ribs, multiple lacerations requiring a total of 47 stitches, mild infection, and the beginning stages of shock, he summarized, reviewing her chart. Considering what you faced, you're in remarkably good condition. No internal bleeding, no punctured lung, no spinal injuries. When can I leave? Nina asked, already feeling confined by the hospital room. We'll keep you at least until tomorrow. Afternoon, possibly longer, depending on how the infection responds to antibiotics. Dr. Mercer hung the chart back at the foot of her bed. The ribs will take at least 6 weeks to heal completely. The sutures can come out in 10 days to 2 weeks, depending on how you heal. You'll need to follow up with your primary care physician back home. The word home struck Nina with unexpected force. Portland seemed impossibly distant, another life belonging to someone else. The Nina who had started up that trail yesterday morning no longer existed. In her place was this new version, marked by trauma and survival. You should also consider speaking with a trauma counselor, the doctor added. Physical wounds aren't the only consequence of experiences like yours. Nina nodded absently, her mind already drifting to the inevitable calls she would need to make, to her parents in Michigan, to her boss in Portland, to the handful of close friends who would be frantic when they heard. The hospital stay stretched to 3 days as the medical team monitored the infection in her wounds. Nina spent the time in a peculiar limbo, physically present in the sterile hospital environment, while mentally replaying the attack in endless variation. Sometimes in her thoughts she fought back, sometimes the bear didn't stop its attack, sometimes help never came. The actual reality, her survival through correct action and sheer luck, seemed almost the least plausible scenario. On the afternoon of her discharge, Nina sat on the edge of the hospital bed while a nurse reviewed her care instructions. Pain management, wound care, activity restrictions, follow-up appointments, the litany of post-trauma protocols washed over her with diminishing impact. What registered more clearly was the nurse's final comment. You should be proud of yourself. Not everyone would have had the presence of mind to play dead, or the strength to reach that cabin afterward. Nina nodded, not trusting her voice. Pride wasn't what she felt, more a hollow gratitude tinged with lingering terror. The randomness of it all haunted her. 1 minute later or earlier on the trail, a different bend taken, a louder call made. Any small variation might have prevented the encounter entirely. A hospital volunteer wheeled Nina to the exit, where a taxi waited to take her to the modest hotel she had booked for 2 nights. Her original return flight to Portland wasn't for 3 more days, and the doctor had been adamant that she shouldn't fly immediately, given her injuries and the cabin pressure's potential impact on her healing ribs. The hotel room offered privacy but little comfort. Nina moved gingerly between bed and bathroom, each shift sending pain radiating through her torso, despite the prescribed medication. On her second day there, she ventured to the ranger station to retrieve her backpack and equipment. The staff treated her with a mixture of concern and barely concealed curiosity. Word of the Grizzly attack had spread through the small community of Jackson Hole, gaining Nina a temporary local notoriety she neither wanted nor appreciated. Ranger Roberts was present, offering a firm handshake and a manila envelope along with her retrieved gear. Incident report, he explained, indicating the envelope, and contact information for the local Fish and Wildlife Service office if you think of any additional details. They're still monitoring the area, but no further encounters have been reported. Nina's backpack showed the evidence of her ordeal, one strap partially torn, claw marks raking across the outer fabric, a large puncture where the bear's teeth had clamped down. The sight of it brought a fresh wave of visceral memory, the key, weight of the bear pressing down, the hot breath on her face. "Are you all right, Miss Patel?" Roberts asked, noticing her sudden pallor. Nina nodded, forcing herself back to the present moment. "Fine, just it's still fresh." Roberts studied her with experienced eyes. "That feeling doesn't go away quickly. I was mauled by a black bear near Yellowstone in '97. Nothing as serious as your encounter, but I still get flashes when I'm in dense cover. Doesn't make me a worse ranger, just makes me a more cautious one." His matter-of-fact acknowledgement of lingering trauma provided unexpected relief. Nina wasn't being weak or dramatic in her reactions. She was experiencing the normal aftermath of an abnormal event. "Does it get easier?" she asked before she could stop herself. Roberts considered the question with appropriate gravity. "Different, not easier. You incorporate it into who you are. It becomes part of your story, not your whole identity." Nina nodded, appreciating his honesty, more than platitudes about time healing all wounds. Back at the hotel, Nina finally made the necessary calls. Her parents reacted with the expected mixture of horror, relief, and renewed concern, extracting a promise that she would come visit them in Ann Arbor once she felt well enough to travel. Her boss was understanding about the extended leave she would need, given her injuries. Friends expressed shock and support, offering to help upon her return to Portland. Throughout these conversations, Nina found herself providing a carefully edited version of events. Yes, she had encountered a grizzly. Yes, she had been injured. Yes, she had received excellent medical care. No, she wasn't traumatized beyond recovery. The full terror of those 8 minutes playing dead, the visceral details of claws tearing, flesh and breath hot against her face. These remained private, too raw to share even with those closest to her. On her final night in Jackson Hole, unable to sleep despite exhaustion and medication, Nina opened her laptop and began to write. The words came in a flood, unfiltered and unstructured. Her preparation for the hike, the beauty of the Wind River, range, the warning signs she had noted but not fully heeded, the sudden violence of the bear's appearance, the interminable 8 minutes of playing dead, the agonizing journey to the cabin, the rescue and aftermath. The act of translating experience into words provided an unexpected catharsis. By the time dawn broke over the Tetons, visible from her hotel window, Nina had written over 7,000 words. It wasn't literature, just an unvarnished account of what had happened and how it had affected her. But as she reread what she had written, Nina recognized something valuable in the narrative, something that might resonate beyond her personal experience. The flight back to Portland was uncomfortable, despite the pain medication and the airline's accommodation of her injured state with extra pillows and a bulkhead seat. Each bout of turbulence sent fresh waves of pain through Nina's broken ribs, and the pressure changes during descent brought tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. Her apartment felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. The houseplants had survived her absence. The mail had collected neatly in her box, and everything remained exactly as she had left it. Yet Nina herself had been fundamentally altered, creating a subtle dissonance between her living space and her current reality. Recovery progressed with agonizing slowness. Physical therapy exercises gradually strengthened the muscles around her healing ribs. The sutures were removed from her lacerations, leaving angry red lines that the doctor assured her would fade to silver over time. Nina returned to work remotely after 2 weeks, grateful for the distraction of familiar coding problems and the structure they imposed on her days. The Chicago job offer remained open, the company willing to postpone her start date until she had recovered fully. The 6-figure salary and comprehensive benefits package represented security and advancement, everything Nina had worked toward in her career. Yet the thought of committing to a life in a concrete landscape, far from mountains and wilderness, filled her with unexpected dread. During her recovery, Nina continued writing, expanding her initial account into something more structured and reflective. The writing became a form of therapy, allowing her to process the attack and its aftermath in manageable segments. She joined an online support group for survivors of animal attacks, finding solace in shared experiences despite the varied circumstances. 6 weeks after the attack, with her ribs largely healed and the angry red of her scars beginning to fade, Nina made 2 significant decisions. First, she declined the Chicago position, choosing instead to remain in Portland, where wilderness access remained part of her life. Second, she submitted a query letter to a literary agent, attaching the first chapters of what she had begun to think of as her memoir. The agent's response came with surprising swiftness, interest in the manuscript, contingent upon revisions and expansions to create a commercially viable book. Nina threw herself into the project, working evenings and weekends around her regular job. The memoir evolved beyond a simple account of the attack to explore broader themes of wilderness ethics, risk assessment, trauma recovery, and humanity's complex relationship with apex predators. By the following spring, Nina had completed the manuscript titled Still, Breathing, a reference both to the technique that had saved her life and the ongoing process of recovery. The agent secured a modest publication deal with a mid-sized publisher specializing in outdoor literature and personal narratives. The advance barely covered Nina's medical expenses, but the validation of her experience felt more valuable than the financial compensation. Publication brought a brief flurry of local media attention. Nina gave interviews to outdoor magazines and participated in a panel discussion on wilderness safety at REI's Portland flagship store. A producer from a cable television show specializing in survival stories contacted her about a potential episode, but Nina declined, unwilling to dramatize or sensationalize what had happened. Throughout this period, Nina continued hiking, though her approach had changed. She no longer ventured solo into grizzly country, instead joining guided groups or reliable partners when exploring such terrain. She became meticulous about safety protocols, sometimes to the point that companions found it excessive. The fear never fully dissipated. Each rustling in trailside brush, each unidentified sound at night sent her heart racing, but she refused to surrender the wilderness activities that had always centered her. Still Breathing sold modestly but steadily, finding an audience among outdoor enthusiasts and survivors of various traumas. Nina received emails from readers who found resonance in her story, some sharing their own experiences of life-altering wilderness encounters. These connections provided meaning beyond what the sales figures or modest royalty checks could offer. Year after publication, Nina received an invitation to speak at a wilderness risk management conference in Chicago. The irony of returning to the city she had declined to live in wasn't lost on her, but the opportunity to contribute to safety education outweighed any personal discomfort. She prepared her presentation carefully, focusing on practical measures, without fear-mongering. The conference hotel overlooked Lake Michigan, offering expansive views of water but no mountains, no forests, no wild spaces where grizzlies might roam. As Nina prepared for her presentation in her room, she caught sight of her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Stripped to her sports bra as she changed, the scars along her right side were clearly visible, 3 parallel lines running from beneath her breast to her hip, their silvery tracks catching the light as she moved. Nina traced them gently with her fingertips, no longer wincing at their touch. These marks had become part of her body's landscape, as familiar as the freckles across her shoulders or the small birthmark on her left wrist. They told a story that most people would never experience, of survival against primal terror, of 8 minutes suspending breath and heartbeat while a predator decided her fate. The Chicago skyline glittered beyond her window, the vast human construction stretching to the horizon. Nina thought of the Wind River Range, where the grizzly that had attacked her still roamed, following ancient instincts through a landscape increasingly constrained by human presence. She felt no animosity toward the bear. It had acted according to its nature, responding to a perceived threat with the tools evolution had provided. The Nina who had begun that hike in Wyoming no longer existed. In her place stood this new version, scarred but whole, carrying the experience within her like the rings of a tree recording a lightning strike. The wilderness had never promised safety, only authenticity, raw, beautiful, and sometimes terrible in its power. Nina finished dressing and gathered her presentation materials. Tomorrow she would return to Portland, to her job developing software, to her small circle of friends who tried to understand but couldn't fully comprehend what had happened to her in those mountains. She would continue hiking, continue writing, continue breathing through moments of unexpected panic when memories surfaced without warning. The grizzly had taken something from her in those terrifying minutes, her sense of invulnerability perhaps, or the luxury of unthinking joy in wild places, but it had also given her something in return, a deeper appreciation for each breath, each step, each moment of connection with the natural world that remained both her passion and her fear. Outside her hotel window, Chicago sprawled in illuminated splendor, a testament to humanity's desire to control and shape its environment. Nina thought of the ranger cabin where she had taken shelter, a humble human outpost in wilderness that remained fundamentally untamed despite all efforts to catalog, manage, and contain it. Both environments had their place, their purpose, their particular beauty and risk. Nina gathered her courage and her presentation notes. She would tell her story again tomorrow, not for notoriety or attention, but because the telling might help others navigate their own encounters with wildness, whether literal or metaphorical. 8 minutes of perfect stillness had saved her life on that mountain trail. Now, a year later, she remained still breathing, marked but not defined by those moments when tooth and claw had tested the boundaries between human and wild. The scars would remain, silver lines mapping a moment when her path had crossed with ancient instinct, but they were only part of her story, not its conclusion. Neena Patel, software developer, author, survivor, stood at her hotel window watching the Chicago lights, feeling the phantom weight of a backpack against her shoulders and hearing, in memory, the whisper of wind through Wyoming pines. Tomorrow, she would speak of danger and survival. Tonight, she simply breathed, counting each inhalation as the gift it was. Now let's move on to the story of the next survivor. The afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of Douglas firs, casting dappled shadows across Carl Dobbs's weathered face as he adjusted the hammock strung between two sturdy tree trunks. At 41, Carl's body bore the evidence of decades spent hunched over engine blocks at his mechanic shop in Roseburg, calloused hands, a persistent crick in his neck, and a lower back that protested most mornings. This solitary weekend getaway to his small cabin in Oregon's Umpqua National Forest was a rare respite from the constant ping of customer notifications and the acrid smell of motor oil that seemed permanently embedded in his skin. Perfect, Carl muttered to himself, giving the hammock's support ropes one final tug before easing his 6-foot frame into the swaying nylon cocoon. He settled his baseball cap over his eyes to block the occasional sunbeam that penetrated the forest canopy. The distant rush of the North Umpqua River provided a soothing soundtrack as a gentle May breeze rustled through the undergrowth. After a morning spent clearing winter debris from around his modest cabin and repairing a leaky corner of the roof, the prospect of a short nap before tackling the rest of his weekend chores was irresistible. Carl's small cabin sat in a clearing, about half a mile from Forest Service Road 4714, accessible via a rough dirt track that tested the suspension of his 1998 Ford F-150 pickup. He'd purchased the place 7 years ago, a fixer-upper that had consumed most of his weekends during the first 3 years of ownership. Now it served as his sanctuary from the growing bustle of Roseburg, which, though still small by most standards, had become too crowded for his taste in recent years. The hammock swayed gently as Carl's breathing deepened. His weekend ritual typically included these afternoon naps in the dappled shade, regardless of the season, though he preferred the mild days of late spring before summer's heat brought out the mosquitoes and the risk of forest fires. The gentle rocking motion worked its magic, and soon Carl was drifting into that pleasant liminal space between wakefulness and sleep. Half a mile away, in a thicket of blackberry bushes and young alder trees, a 3-year-old male black bear lifted its head, nostrils flaring as it caught an unfamiliar scent. The bear, approximately 250 pounds with a glossy black coat, had been foraging since dawn, its powerful claws tearing apart rotting logs to expose carpenter ants and beetle larvae. Spring had been lean so far, and the bear's winter fat reserves had dwindled during the months of semi-hibernation. Now, with growing hunger driving its movements, the young male had been venturing ever closer to the scattered human habitations that dotted the forest's edge. The bear rose onto its hind legs, its sensitive nose sampling the air currents. The scent it detected wasn't food, not directly, but something else that piqued its curiosity. Black bears, despite their reputation for shyness around humans, are fundamentally inquisitive creatures. This particular bear, having encountered little direct human contact in its young life, lacked the wariness that older bears often develop. Its mother, who had driven it away last year as she prepared to mate again, had been similarly bold, occasionally raiding bird feeders and trash cans at the forest's periphery. With a soft huff, the bear dropped back to all fours and began moving. In the direction of the unfamiliar scent, its passage through the undergrowth surprisingly quiet for an animal of its size. The barely perceptible cracking of twigs and rustling of leaves blended seamlessly with the forest's ambient sounds. The distant tap of a woodpecker, the scolding chatter of a Douglas squirrel, the gentle sigh of wind through the treetops. Carl shifted in the hammock, his hat slipping slightly as one arm dangled toward the forest floor. He'd fallen into a deeper sleep than intended, his body surrendering to the accumulation of weekly fatigue. A soft snore escaped his lips, the sound barely audible against the backdrop of forest noises. In his dreams, he was back in his shop, explaining to Mrs. Henderson for the third time why her check engine light kept illuminating despite his repeated interventions. The imaginary conversation looped in the peculiar way of dreams, with Mrs. Henderson's face occasionally morphing into that of his ex-wife, Janet, who had left Roseburg and him 4 years ago for a dental hygienist position in Portland. The black bear paused at the edge of the clearing, its small ears swiveling to locate the source of the unfamiliar sound. The human scent was stronger here, mixed with the chemical odors of soap, laundry detergent, and the faint metallic tang that seemed to cling to all human habitations. But it was the rhythmic, rumbling sound that captured the bear's attention, a sound unlike anything in its limited experience. Caution briefly warred with curiosity as the bear hesitated at the forest's edge. Its natural instincts suggested retreat, but hunger and inquisitiveness propelled it forward. With deliberate, measured steps, the bear entered the clearing, its head low, muscles tensed for immediate flight if necessary. Carl's cabin stood silent and undisturbed, its windows reflecting the afternoon sunlight. The strange rumbling sound was coming from elsewhere, from the swaying object suspended between 2 Douglas firs at the clearing's far edge. The bear approached obliquely, circling to keep downwind of the potential threat, its movements betraying a mixture of caution and interest. When the bear was approximately 20 feet from the hammock, Carl's snoring hitched, then resumed with a slightly louder cadence. The bear froze, its dark eyes fixed on the swaying form. For several heartbeats it remained motionless, assessing. Then, ever so slowly, it continued its approach, drawing within 10 feet of the hammock. A chickadee's alarm call pierced the afternoon quiet, the sharp chickadee-dee-dee causing the bear to pause again. But the human in the strange hanging nest didn't stir, and after a moment, the bear resumed its cautious advance. Carl's dream had shifted. He was fishing now, standing thigh-deep in the North Umpqua's cold current, feeling the pull of the river against his waders. The fishing line went taut, and he felt the electric thrill of a strike, a steelhead, he was certain. He began reeling, the fish fighting powerfully against the hook, when a strange scent intruded into the dreamscape, a musky, earthy odor that didn't belong on the crystalline river. The bear was now directly beside the hammock, close enough that its exhaled breath stirred the fabric near Carl's dangling hand. It rose hesitantly onto its hind legs, bringing its head level with the sleeping human, its nostrils working to process the complex bouquet of scents, the alien chemical smells of civilization overlaid with the more primal odors of sweat and skin. The bear's lip curled slightly, exposing a glimpse of yellowed canines. Something penetrated Carl's slumber, a change in the air, a presence sensed rather than heard. His eyelids fluttered, the dream beginning to dissolve around the edges as consciousness reasserted itself. Then his dangling hand brushed against something solid and furred, and his eyes snapped open. For one surreal moment, time seemed suspended as Carl found himself staring directly into the dark eyes of the black bear, their faces less than 3 feet apart. The bear's wet nose twitched, sampling his scent, and Carl could feel the warm exhalation of its breath against his cheek. His mind struggled to process the impossible reality confronting him, a bear, an actual bear, close enough to touch. Then the moment shattered. Carl jerked upright with a startled shout, the sudden movement causing the hammock to swing wildly. The bear, equally startled, dropped to all fours and backed away, huffing in agitation. Carl's hat fell to the ground, and he scrambled to get his feet under him, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Hey! Hey!" Carl yelled, his voice cracking, with panic, as he tried to make himself look larger, arms flailing as he struggled to extricate himself from the hammock's confines. His right foot caught in the fabric, and he felt himself losing balance. With a yelp, Carl tumbled from the hammock, landing hard on his left shoulder with a painful jolt that knocked the wind from his lungs. The bear, confused by the human's erratic movements and loud vocalizations, took several more steps backward, huffing and woofing, warning sounds indicating its own anxiety, but rather than fleeing outright, it held its ground, swaying slightly from side to side in indecision. Carl scrambled backward on hands and heels, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he tried to put distance between himself and the bear. His mind raced through half-remembered advice about bear encounters: make yourself look big, make noise, back away slowly, Don't run, don't run, don't run, but fear was rapidly overwhelming rational thought. Get out of here, he bellowed, grabbing a fallen branch and waving it threateningly as he gained his feet. Go on, Git! The bear flinched at the sudden movement but held its position, its initial curiosity now overlaid with defensive aggression. It popped its jaws, a series of quick, sharp sounds, and swung its head from side to side, signaling mounting stress. Carl's gaze darted toward the cabin, gauging the distance. 30 yards of open ground. Could he make it? Should he try? Everything he'd ever heard about bear encounters advised against running, but standing his ground seemed equally terrifying. The bear wasn't backing down. If anything, its posture suggested escalating agitation. Easy, Carl said, modulating his voice to a lower register despite the fear constricting his throat. Easy now, I'm just gonna back away, nice and slow. He began edging sideways, keeping his eyes on the bear while trying to angle toward the cabin. The branch trembled in his white-knuckled grip, betraying the adrenaline coursing through his system. For a few seconds, the strategy seemed to be working. The bear remained in place, watching Carl's retreat with apparent uncertainty. Then Carl's heel caught on an exposed root, and he stumbled slightly, the branch swishing through the air as he fought to regain his balance. The sudden movement triggered something in the bear. With a huffing bark, it charged, not a full predatory rush, but the short, bluff charge that black bears often employ to drive away perceived threats. But intention made little difference to Carl, who saw only 250 pounds of muscle and claw hurtling toward him at alarming speed. Pure instinct took over. Carl turned and ran, the forbidden response overwhelming all rational thought. He made it perhaps 10 yards before realizing his mistake. The bear was between him and the cabin. He veered sharply right, aiming for the nearest sizable tree that might offer refuge. Behind him, the bear's bluff charge had evolved into pursuit, the human's flight triggering a predatory response. Carl could hear the huffing breaths and the thud of heavy paws against earth as he sprinted toward a massive Douglas fir, his boots slipping on the carpet of pine needles. "Help!" he screamed reflexively, the cry tearing from his throat despite the certainty that no one was near enough to hear. "Somebody help!" 3 strides from the tree, Carl risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the bear almost upon him, its mouth open in what appeared to be a nightmarish grin. He lunged for the lowest branch of the Douglas fir, hands closing around rough bark as he tried to haul himself upward. The bear reared up behind him, its front paw swiping in an arc that connected with Carl's right calf. Pain exploded through, his leg as claws tore through denim and flesh. Carl screamed, his grip on the branch faltering, and then the bear's jaws closed around his left foot. Even through his hiking boot, the pressure was excruciating. Carl kicked desperately with his free leg, his heel connecting with the bear's snout. The bear released its grip with a startled huff, rearing back momentarily. In that brief reprieve, Carl summoned a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength and pulled himself onto the branch, scrambling higher as the bear recovered and rose again on its hind legs, powerful forepaws scrabbling at the tree trunk. "Get away!" Carl screamed, kicking at the bear's reaching paws while trying to climb higher. His right calf throbbed where the claws had raked him, and his left ankle felt as though it had been caught in a vice. He could feel warm wetness soaking his pant, leg and boot. Blood. His mind registered distantly through the haze of terror and pain. The bear dropped back to all fours, circling the tree with agitated huffs and woofs, occasionally rising to test its ability to reach Carl. But the mechanic had managed to climb to a height of about 12 feet, beyond the bear's reach but not nearly high enough for comfort. Carl clung to the trunk, breath coming in ragged gasps, as rivulets of blood trickled down his leg and dripped onto the forest floor below. Time seemed to stretch and distort as Carl watched the bear's movements through tear-blurred eyes. The pain in his leg and foot was evolving from the initial sharp agony to a deep, pulsating throb that seemed to expand with each heartbeat. His hands trembled against the rough bark, and he could feel the cold sweat of shock beginning to dampen his shirt despite the afternoon warmth. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably less than 5 minutes, the bear's circling became less energetic. It stopped beneath the tree, rose once more on its hind legs with a final frustrated huff, then dropped to all fours and ambled toward the cabin at an unhurried pace. Carl watched in disbelief as the bear investigated his small propane grill, sniffing curiously at the cover before losing interest and turning its attention to the cabin's screened porch. "No, no, no," Carl muttered as the bear pushed experimentally at the screen door. But the latch held, and after several attempts the bear abandoned this effort as well. It circled the cabin once, pausing to investigate the garbage can, secured in a bear-proof container after Carl's neighbor had experienced a messy intrusion the previous summer, then wandered toward the tree line at the clearing's opposite edge. For several minutes after the bear disappeared into the forest, Carl remained frozen in place, straining to detect any sign of its return. The forest had gone eerily quiet in the wake of the encounter, the usual background chorus of birds and insects temporarily silenced. Only the distant rush of the river and the sound of his own labored breathing reached his ears. Gradually, the reality of his situation began to penetrate the fog of fear and adrenaline. He was injured, bleeding, and stuck in a tree at least half a mile from the nearest neighbor. His cell phone, not that it would have reception this deep in the forest, was inside the cabin. The sun was still high, but he guessed it was approaching 4 o'clock. He had perhaps 4 hours of daylight remaining. "Think," Carl said aloud, the sound of his voice oddly reassuring in the silent forest. "Just think this through." He shifted carefully on the branch, trying to assess the severity of his injuries. The movement sent a spike of pain through his left ankle, and he bit back a cry. His hiking boot was torn, the leather punctured in several places by the bear's teeth, and blood had soaked through the material, creating a dark stain. His right calf fared little better. He could see 4 parallel tears in his jeans where the bear's claws had raked him, the fabric darkening with blood. Carl took a deep, steadying breath, fighting against the rising tide of panic. He needed to get back to the cabin, treat his wounds, and figure out how to summon help. But first, he needed to be certain the bear wasn't waiting in ambush nearby. "Hello?" he called out, then louder. "Hello? Anybody out there?" His voice echoed through the trees, answered only by the startled flight of a raven from a nearby branch. After several more minutes of tense listening, Carl decided he had little choice but to risk descent. Wincing against the pain, he began to carefully make his way down the tree, testing each foothold and handhold before committing his weight. When he reached the lowest branch, Carl hesitated, scanning the clearing one final time before dropping to the ground. His injured left ankle buckled as it took his weight, and he fell to his knees with a muffled curse. For a moment he remained there, vulnerable and exposed, half expecting the bear to come charging from the undergrowth to finish what it had started. But the clearing remained still and silent. After a deep breath, Carl pushed himself to his feet, grimacing as pain lanced through his injured leg. He limped toward the cabin, alert for any movement, the adrenaline gradually ebbing from his system and leaving room for the full measure of pain to assert itself. At the cabin door, he fumbled with the lock, hands trembling so violently that it took 3 attempts to insert the key. Once inside, he slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, then sagged against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the plank floor. Only then, in the relative safety of his cabin, did Carl allow himself to process what had happened. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice cracking. "A bear. A goddamn bear." The cabin's interior was cool and dim, the afternoon sun not yet reaching the west-facing windows. Carl's breathing gradually slowed, though his heart continued to race. After several minutes of simply sitting and shaking, the practical part of his mind, the mechanic's problem-solving instinct, began to reassert itself. He needed to assess and treat his injuries, try to contact help, and secure the cabin against any return visit from the bear. With effort, Carl pulled himself up, using the small table beside the door, and limped to the bathroom. The tiny space barely accommodated a shower stall, toilet, and sink, but it contained a first aid kit mounted on the wall, one that he'd conscientiously stocked for emergencies, but never actually needed to use. Lowering himself onto the closed toilet lid, Carl gingerly removed his shredded hiking boot and sock. The sight that greeted him made his stomach lurch. His ankle was already swelling, the skin discolored with deepening bruises, and puncture wounds dotted the flesh where the bear's teeth had penetrated. Though none of the wounds appeared to be spurting, suggesting no major arteries had been hit, blood continued to seep steadily from several of the deeper punctures. "Shit, shit, shit," Carl muttered, reaching for the first aid kit with shaking hands. He unlatched the plastic case and assessed its contents. Gauze pads, adhesive bandages of various sizes, medical tape, a small bottle of antiseptic solution, antibiotic ointment, a pair of blunt-tipped scissors, tweezers, and a packet of over-the-counter pain relievers. Better than nothing, but hardly adequate for injuries of this severity. Still, he had little choice. Carl took a deep breath and got to work, first cutting away the lower portion of his jeans to expose the claw wounds on his right calf. 4 deep lacerations ran diagonally across his calf muscle, each several inches long, the edges jagged where the bear's claws had torn rather than cut the flesh. The wounds were bleeding sluggishly, and Carl could see yellowish subcutaneous fat in the deepest portions. "Probably need stitches," he said aloud, the professional assessment somehow helping to distance himself from the situation. "Definitely. Gonna leave scars." He cleaned the wounds as best he could, wincing as the antiseptic solution bubbled in the torn flesh, then applied antibiotic ointment and covered the lacerations with gauze pads, securing them with medical tape. It wasn't pretty, but it would have to do. His ankle proved more challenging. The puncture, wounds created by the bear's teeth, were deeper and continued to bleed steadily, despite his efforts to clean and bandage them. Moreover, the ankle itself was rapidly swelling, suggesting possible fractures or torn ligaments beneath the surface. Wounds. After doing what he could with the first aid supplies, Carl fashioned a crude compression bandage, using an ace bandage from the kit, and propped his foot on a small footstool. Only when he'd addressed his immediate injuries did Carl remember his cell phone. He dug it from his pocket with a surge of hope that died as soon as he checked the screen. No service, just as he'd expected. The cabin was too remote, too deeply nestled in the forest valley for reliable reception. Carl glanced at his watch. 4:23 p.m. He'd slept longer than intended in the hammock, and the encounter with the bear had consumed nearly an hour. If he'd been following his usual routine, he would have started preparing an early dinner around this time, then perhaps read for a while before turning in early. Instead, he found himself injured, isolated, and increasingly aware that he needed professional medical attention. His gaze fell on the satellite radio he kept on a shelf beside the small wood stove, not a communication device, but at least a connection to the outside world. He switched it on, turning the dial until he found a local station broadcasting from Roseburg. The familiar voices discussing local news and weather provided a surreal counterpoint to his situation. Expect temperatures to remain mild through the weekend with a chance of showers by Sunday evening, the meteorologist was saying, as though Carl's world hadn't just been violently upended. He turned the volume down and considered his options. His neighbor Tom Grayson had a cabin about half a mile away, but Carl wasn't certain if Tom was up for the weekend. Even if he was, Carl doubted his ability to walk that distance in his current condition. His truck was parked outside, but driving, with his injured left foot, would be challenging and potentially dangerous on the narrow, winding forest roads. The third option was his emergency radio, a handheld two-way that could reach the Forest Service ranger station about 15 miles away. It wasn't ideal, as the mountainous terrain often interfered with clear transmission, but it represented his best chance of summoning help. Carl limped to the cabinet above the small kitchen counter and retrieved the radio. He'd checked the batteries before heading up for the weekend, a habit ingrained from years of backcountry outings, but he tested it again now, relieved when the power light illuminated. Pressing the transmit button, Carl spoke clearly. "This is Carl Dobbs calling from private cabin adjacent to FS Road 4714, approximately mile marker 27. Do you copy?" Static hissed from the speaker. Carl repeated the call, adjusting the frequency slightly, but received no response. He tried several more times before accepting that the ranger station might be unmanned at this hour, or that the signal simply wasn't reaching through the dense forest and rugged terrain. Carl set the radio on the table, leaving it on in case. Someone responded later and turned his attention to securing the cabin. The windows were already closed. He'd shut them before heading out to set up the hammock, not wanting to invite insects inside, but he double-checked the latches now. The main door was solid wood with a deadbolt, and the screen door on the porch had a simple hook-and-eye latch that had already proven sufficient to deter the bear's initial investigation. Satisfied that he'd done what he could to secure the cabin, Carl eased himself into the armchair facing the main window, elevating his injured ankle on an ottoman. The throbbing pain had settled into a steady pulse, and he could feel the tightness of swelling against the compression bandage. He swallowed 4 ibuprofen tablets from the first aid kit, washing them down with water from a bottle he retrieved. from the small refrigerator. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Carl found himself repeatedly scanning the tree line for any sign of the bear's return. The ibuprofen had taken the edge off the pain, but done nothing for the underlying anxiety that had him flinching at every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside the cabin. He understood on an intellectual level that black bears rarely returned to the scene of human encounters, especially ones that had proven stressful for the bear, but logic provided cold comfort against the visceral memory of hot breath on his face and teeth puncturing his flesh. Around 6:30 p.m., as shadows lengthened, across the clearing, Carl's vigilance was rewarded or perhaps punished when movement at the forest's edge caught his eye. He tensed, hand automatically reaching for the hunting knife he kept on the side table, when he realized what he was seeing. Not the bear returning, but a doe and her fawn cautiously emerging from the trees to browse on the tender spring growth at the clearing's edge. The sight brought an unexpected lump to Carl's throat. The peaceful tableau, mother and offspring moving with delicate precision through the early evening light, stood in stark contrast to the violence he'd experienced hours earlier. He watched them for several minutes until they gradually worked their way back into the forest, unaware of the human observer or the drama that had played out in their territory. As darkness fell, Carl faced the unwelcome realization that he would need to spend the night at the cabin despite his injuries. He made another attempt with the emergency radio, this time trying the frequency used by local search and rescue volunteers, but again received only static in response. He left the radio on, volume turned up in case someone responded overnight. Moving gingerly to minimize pain, Carl prepared a sparse dinner from the supplies he'd brought for the weekend, canned soup heated on the propane stove, accompanied by slightly stale crackers. He wasn't particularly hungry, but understood the importance of maintaining his strength. After eating, he took 2 more ibuprofen tablets, noting with concern that the bottle was already half empty. Sleep seemed an unlikely prospect, but Carl knew he needed to rest. He moved from the armchair to the small bedroom, not bothering to undress beyond removing his torn and bloodied shirt. The bed, a full-size mattress on a simple frame, felt simultaneously comforting and exposing. Though he knew intellectually that he was safer inside the cabin than in the hammock where the attack had occurred, his body remained in a state of hypervigilance, muscles tensed for flight. Despite his certainty that sleep would prove elusive, exhaustion eventually overcame fear. Carl drifted into uneasy slumber sometime past midnight, his dreams a chaotic montage of pursuing shapes and gleaming teeth. He woke repeatedly throughout the night, heart pounding, certain he'd heard the sound of claws scratching at the cabin door. Each time he would lie motionless, straining to hear above the pounding of his own pulse, before convincing himself it had been imagination or one of the forest's countless natural sounds. Dawn broke with the liquid trill of a hermit thrush somewhere nearby, the simple melody piercing the early morning mist that had settled over the clearing. Carl blinked awake, momentarily disoriented, then hissed as pain reasserted itself when he shifted position. The events of the previous day came flooding back, and he lay still for several minutes, gathering courage to face what he knew would be a difficult day. When he finally forced himself to sit up, Carl was dismayed to discover that his injuries had worsened overnight. The bandages on his calf were stiff with dried blood, and when he carefully unwrapped them, he found the wounds hot to the touch. The surrounding skin reddened, early signs of infection. His ankle had swollen further, stretching the skin taut and shiny, and had acquired a rainbow of bruising that spread up his calf and down across his foot. Attempting to rotate or flex the joint produced pain so intense it left him lightheaded. "Not good," he muttered, the understatement almost laughable in its inadequacy. After rebandaging the wounds as best he could, Carl checked the emergency radio. The batteries were still good, but no one had responded to his calls from the previous day. He tried again, this time identifying his communication as an emergency and briefly describing his situation. Again, only static answered him. Carl limped to the main room, leaning heavily against the wall for support, and peered through the window. The clearing looked peaceful in the early light, no sign of the black bear or any other large wildlife. He considered his options again and reached a reluctant conclusion. He would have to try to drive himself out. The prospect was daunting. The dirt track connecting his cabin to the Forest Service Road was rough at the best of times, with ruts and washouts that challenged even his truck's four-wheel drive. Navigating it with an injured left foot, his clutch foot no less, would be a significant challenge. But the alternative was waiting and hoping someone would notice his absence and come looking, which could mean days rather than hours, given his solitary habits. Decision made, Carl gathered what he would need. His keys, wallet, phone, useless, now but necessary once he reached civilization, a water bottle, and the remaining ibuprofen tablets. He fashioned a makeshift walking stick from a broom handle, then steeled himself for the painful journey to his truck. Opening the cabin door required a moment of psychological preparation. Though daylight had fully arrived, the memory of the bear's presence was still viscerally fresh. Carl scanned the clearing thoroughly before stepping onto the porch, clutching his improvised walking stick with white-knuckled intensity. The distance to his truck, perhaps 30 yards, had never seemed so vast. Each step on his injured ankle sent spikes of pain shooting up his leg, and he could feel the wounds on his calf reopening with the movement, warm blood beginning to seep through the fresh bandages. But fear provided powerful motivation, and Carl pushed through the pain, scanning the tree line continuously as he made his halting progress toward the vehicle. Reaching the truck brought a surge of relief so profound it left him weak-kneed. Carl leaned against the sun-warmed metal of the driver's door, breathing heavily from the exertion and pain of the short journey. After a moment to recover, he unlocked the door and hauled himself into the driver's seat, wincing as his injured leg protested the movement. The familiar interior of the old Ford offered a small measure of comfort, the worn seat conforming to his body, the faint scent of motor oil and pine-scented air freshener, the smooth feel of the steering wheel beneath his hands. Carl inserted the key with fingers that trembled slightly, then paused, mentally rehearsing the process of starting and driving with his injuries. He would need to use his right foot for both accelerator and brake. Awkward but manageable. The bare clutch presented a greater challenge. Pressing it would require using his injured left foot, which currently shrieked in protest at the slightest pressure. Gritting his teeth, Carl tested his theory, trying to depress the clutch pedal. Pain exploded through his ankle, and he pulled back with a strangled cry. "Come on," he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "You can do this. You have to do this." On the second attempt, Carl forced himself to push through the pain, feeling the clutch engage as tears sprang to his eyes. He turned the key, and the truck's engine rumbled to life, the familiar sound, oddly reassuring in the morning quiet. Shifting into first gear with a grinding sound that would have made him wince under normal circumstances, Carl released the clutch more abruptly than usual in his haste to relieve the pressure on his injured foot. The truck lurched forward, engine nearly stalling before catching again. He guided the vehicle down the rough track that served as his driveway, each bump and rut sending fresh waves of pain through his injured leg. The half-mile to the Forest Service Road took nearly 15 minutes to navigate, the truck crawling at walking pace as Carl struggled to manage the pedals while minimizing movement of his left foot. Sweat soaked his shirt by the time he reached the junction, and he paused there, breathing heavily, to consult the map he kept in the glove compartment. The nearest hospital was in Roseburg, about 40 miles away. Under normal circumstances, the drive would take just over an hour, given the winding nature of the forest roads that eventually connected to Highway 138. In his current condition, Carl estimated it might take twice that long. He swallowed 2 more ibuprofen tablets, took a swig from his water bottle, and put the truck in gear once more. The Forest Service Road was marginally better maintained than his private track, but still challenged his driving abilities. Each gear change became an exercise in pain tolerance, and Carl found himself gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched. He tried to find a sustainable speed that would minimize the need for shifting, settling into a rhythm that carried him steadily, if slowly, toward the main highway. About 5 miles in, the road curved around a rocky outcropping, and Carl was forced to downshift to navigate the sharp turn. As he pressed the clutch, a particularly vicious spike of pain shot through his ankle, momentarily. Whiting out his vision, the truck drifted toward the shoulder and Carl overcorrected, sending the vehicle lurching across the center of the narrow road before he regained control. "Focus," he told himself sharply, heart pounding from the near miss. "Just focus on the road." The incident left him shaken but more determined. He continued at an even more cautious pace, hands trembling slightly on the wheel. The forest passed in a green blur on either side, sunlight now filtering strongly through the canopy as morning advanced toward noon. Under different circumstances, it would have been a pleasant drive through spectacular scenery. Now each mile merely represented progress toward urgently needed medical attention. Nearly an hour after leaving the cabin, Carl reached the junction with Highway 138. The sight of the paved road, with its clearly marked lanes and smoother surface, brought a surge of relief. He turned east, toward Roseburg, settling into fourth gear with a grimace of pain that gradually eased as he was able to maintain a steady speed without frequent gear changes. Traffic was light on the rural highway, and Carl encountered only a handful of other vehicles as he made his way toward town. He considered stopping at the Dry Creek store, a small general store and gas station about halfway to Roseburg, but decided against it. His injuries needed proper medical attention, not the first aid supplies available at a country store. Better to push through to the hospital. As he drove, Carl's mind drifted back to the attack. Details that had been obscured by panic and adrenaline began to surface. The glossy blackness of the bear's coat, the surprising softness of its fur when his hand had inadvertently brushed against it, the strange, almost dog-like quality of its huffing breaths. He found himself wondering about the animal's motivation. Had it been simple curiosity, hunger, or had Carl unknowingly provoked it by his presence in its territory? The questions had no immediate answers, and Carl pushed them aside as the outskirts of Roseburg came into view. He navigated through increasingly busy streets, painfully aware of his disheveled appearance and the blood-stained bandages visible on his leg. At a red light, the driver of a neighboring car, a middle-aged woman in a sensible sedan, did a double-take upon noticing him, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. Carl offered a tight nod of acknowledgement, but felt relieved when the light changed and she drove on. The emergency room entrance of Mercy Medical Center appeared ahead, and Carl felt a wave of mingled relief and apprehension. He pulled into the parking lot, choosing a space near the entrance, and shut off the engine. For a moment he simply sat there, the sudden absence of the truck's rumble highlighting the throbbing pain in his leg and the ragged sound of his own breathing. Then, gathering his resolve, he opened the door and began the arduous process of extracting himself from the vehicle. The walk from the parking space to the emergency room entrance, though only about 30 yards, tested the limits of Carl's endurance. By the time he pushed through the automatic doors, leaning heavily on his makeshift walking stick, his bandages were soaked through with fresh blood, and a cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. The waiting room was moderately busy for a Saturday afternoon. Heads turned as Carl limped toward the reception desk, leaving small irregular bloodstains on the linoleum floor. The triage nurse, a petite woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, assessed him with a single glance and immediately rose from her seat. "Sir, what happened?" she asked, already moving to support him as his knees threatened to buckle. "Bear attack," Carl managed, the words sounding surreal even to his own ears. "Yesterday at my cabin." The nurse's eyes widened momentarily before professional composure reasserted itself. "Let's get you into a room right away," she said, signaling to an orderly who approached with a wheelchair. Events began to blur as Carl was whisked through the emergency department protocols. His vital signs were taken, an IV line established, and preliminary questions asked about the nature of his injuries. The attending physician, Dr. Patel according to her name badge, examined his wounds with careful efficiency, her expression growing increasingly concerned as she assessed the puncture wounds on his ankle and the deep lacerations on his calf. "You've been walking on this?" she asked, looking up from her examination with a mixture of disbelief and professional disapproval. "Had to," Carl replied simply. "No cell service, drove myself." Dr. Patel nodded, her expression softening slightly. "You're going to need x-rays, possible surgery for the ankle, and definitely antibiotics for these wounds," she said. "Animal bites carry a high risk of infection, and these are already showing signs of it." "Could have told you that," Carl said with a weak attempt at humor. "I'm also required to report animal attacks to the County Health Department and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife," Dr. Patel continued, making notes on a tablet. "Someone will want to take a statement from you about the incident." Carl nodded tiredly. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the drive was ebbing rapidly, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and the increasingly insistent pain from his injuries. A nurse arrived with a syringe, administered something through his IV line, and within minutes a blessed numbness began to spread through his leg, followed by a general sense of detachment that suggested a sedative had been included in the medication. Time lost its linear quality as Carl was wheeled to radiology for X-rays, then returned to the emergency department for cleaning and debridement of his wounds. Dr. Patel confirmed that his ankle had sustained multiple fractures from the crushing force of the bear's jaws, and that he would require surgery to stabilize the joint. The lacerations on his calf were deep enough to need stitches, but had narrowly missed severing major tendons or blood vessels. "You're actually quite fortunate," Dr. Patel told him as she prepared for the stitching procedure. "Bear attacks often result in much more severe injuries. This appears to have been more of a defensive response than a predatory one." "Doesn't feel like good luck from where I'm sitting," Carl muttered, though the pain medications had muted his distress to a manageable level. "I understand," Dr. Patel said, her voice gentle, "but you survived. You made it here under your own power, and you should make a full recovery, though it will take time." The stitching process was uncomfortable despite local anesthesia, and Carl found himself focusing on the ceiling tiles to distract from the tugging sensation as Dr. Patel closed the lacerations on his calf. 27 stitches later, fresh bandages were applied, and he was moved to a curtained bay to await transfer to the surgical department for his ankle. It was there, drifting in a medication-induced haze, that Carl received his first official visitor. A tall man in the olive-green uniform of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife entered the bay, notebook in hand. "Mr. Dobbs, I'm Ranger Mike Harding with ODFW. Dr. Patel mentioned you'd had an encounter with a bear. If you're feeling up to it, I'd like to get some details." Carl struggled to focus through the fog of medication. "Sure," he managed. "Not much to tell, was taking a nap in my hammock. Bear showed up, tried to get away, but it caught me." Ranger Harding pulled up a chair beside the bed. "I understand. You're not feeling your best right now, but any information you can provide will help us assess the situation. We take bear encounters very seriously, especially when injuries are involved." Over the next 20 minutes, Carl recounted the events as clearly as his medicated state allowed. The nap in the hammock, waking to find the bear investigating, him, the chase and attack, his night at the cabin and the drive to the hospital. Ranger Harding took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the bear's size, behavior, and specific location of the encounter. "Based on your description, it sounds like a young male black bear, probably 3 to 4 years old," Ranger Harding said, when Carl had finished. "This time of year they're hungry after winter, and sometimes get bolder than usual in their search for food. Your snoring might have triggered its curiosity. Unusual sounds sometimes do that." "Great," Carl said with a weak laugh. "Attacked because I snore? We'll need to investigate the area," Ranger Harding continued. "If this bear is showing aggressive behavior toward humans, we may need to relocate or euthanize it. Bears that have attacked humans once sometimes lose their natural wariness and become more dangerous." The thought of the bear being killed because of their encounter left Carl with an unexpected twinge of discomfort. Despite his injuries and the terror he'd experienced, he found himself reluctant to condemn the animal for what had essentially been a natural response to a strange situation. "It wasn't really hunting me," he said slowly. "More like it got scared when I startled awake. Probably would have just sniffed around and moved on if I hadn't freaked out." Ranger Harding nodded. "That's often the case with black bears. They're naturally curious but rarely predatory toward humans. Still, we have protocols to follow when attacks occur." Before Carl could respond, a nurse appeared to inform him that the surgical team was ready. As he was wheeled away, Ranger Harding assured him he would follow up later and asked for the exact location of Carl's cabin so a team could investigate the site. The surgery itself was a blur to Carl, consciousness fading as the anesthesia took effect and returning gradually in the recovery room, where he found himself with a heavily bandaged and elevated left foot, a new collection of monitors beeping softly nearby, and a profound sense of disorientation. A recovery room nurse noticed his return to awareness and approached with a reassuring smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Dobbs. The surgery went well. Dr. Khoury inserted several pins to stabilize the broken bones in your ankle. You'll be moved to a regular room shortly, and he'll come by to explain everything in more detail once you're fully awake." Carl managed a groggy nod, still too disoriented to formulate a coherent response. By the time he was settled in a regular hospital room, evening had fallen, the room's window showing only darkness relieved by the distant glow of the hospital parking lot lights. Dr. Khoury, the orthopedic surgeon, visited as promised, explaining that Carl had sustained multiple fractures to the talus and calcaneus bones in his ankle, as well as significant soft tissue damage from the puncture wounds. The surgical repair had been successful, but recovery would require several weeks in a cast, followed by extensive physical therapy. The lacerations on his calf would heal more quickly, but would likely leave noticeable scarring. "You're looking at about 6 weeks in a cast, Mr. Dobbs," Dr. Khoury concluded. "After that, we'll reassess and likely transition you to a walking boot for another month or so. During that time, you'll need to work with a physical therapist to regain full function." Carl absorbed this information with a growing sense of dismay. He lived alone, worked a physically demanding job, and had few close friends or family nearby who could assist during what was clearly going to be a lengthy recovery. "When can I go back to work?" he asked, thinking of the small auto repair shop where he served as both owner and primary mechanic. Dr. Khoury's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Light duty, possibly in 4 to 6 weeks if healing progresses well. Full resumption of physically demanding work. I wouldn't expect that for at least 3 to 4 months, possibly longer." The news hit Carl like a physical blow. His business operated on thin margins in the best of times. An extended absence could be financially devastating. He had some savings and basic health insurance, but nothing that would fully cushion such a prolonged inability to work. "I see," he said finally, unable to fully process the implications in his current state. "We'll have a social worker visit tomorrow to discuss resources that might be available to help during your recovery," Dr. Khoury added, seeming to sense Carl's concerns. "For now, rest is the priority. The nurse can provide pain medication if you need it." After the doctor left, Carl lay awake despite his exhaustion, staring at the ceiling as the reality of his situation gradually sank in. The bear encounter itself, terrifying as it had been, now seemed almost secondary to the cascade of consequences flowing from it: physical recovery, financial strain, the practical challenges of managing daily life with severely limited mobility. His troubled thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, a uniformed police officer who introduced himself as Deputy Marsh from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Dobbs," Deputy Marsh said, "but I need to take an official report about the bear attack. It's standard procedure when wildlife attacks result in human injury." Carl sighed but nodded agreement. For the second time that day, he recounted the events at his cabin, this telling somewhat clearer than the version he'd given Ranger Harding, as the stronger painkillers had worn off slightly. Deputy Marsh's questions were similar to the Ranger's, though he seemed particularly interested in Carl's actions before and during the encounter. "Had you stored food properly? Any cooking smells that might have attracted the bear? Did you have bear spray or other deterrents available?" The questions carried a subtle implication of blame that irritated Carl despite his fatigue. "I was taking a nap," he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Wasn't cooking, wasn't eating, just sleeping in a hammock on my own property." Deputy Marsh nodded, making a note. "And you said you ran when the bear charged? The standard advice is to stand your ground with black bears." "Yeah, well, standard advice wasn't exactly at the forefront of my mind with 250 pounds of bear coming at me," Carl retorted, then immediately regretted his sharp tone. "Sorry, it's been a long day." "No apology necessary," Deputy Marsh said, his expression softening slightly. "Most people don't react perfectly in crisis situations. I'm just trying to get a complete picture for the report." After a few more questions, the deputy thanked Carl for his time and left. A nurse arrived shortly thereafter with pain medication, which Carl accepted gratefully, sinking into a dreamless sleep almost immediately after swallowing the pills. Morning brought a series of medical professionals, doctors making rounds, nurses changing bandages and checking vital signs, a physical therapist who discussed future rehabilitation plans, and finally, as promised, a hospital social worker who arrived with a folder full of pamphlets and forms. "Mr. Dobbs, I'm Diane Westfield from Patient Services," she introduced herself, pulling a chair up to his bedside. "Dr. Khoury asked me to discuss some resources that might help during your recovery period." Carl straightened in the bed, wincing as the movement jostled his injured leg. "I appreciate that," he said, To be honest, I'm not sure how I'm going to manage. I live alone and my business. Diane nodded understandingly. That's exactly why I'm here. Let's start with the practical aspects of your return home. Do you have stairs in your house? Anyone who could stay with you during the initial recovery period? The conversation that followed was both reassuring and sobering. Diane outlined various support services, home health aides, meal delivery options, temporary disability benefits, but each came with limitations, costs, or complicated application processes. By the time she left, Carl had a better understanding of the help available, but also a clearer picture of the challenges ahead. The day continued with more medical interventions, including the application of a proper cast to replace the temporary post-surgical bandaging on his ankle. Carl was beginning to feel restless and frustrated by his confinement when Ranger Harding reappeared late in the afternoon. "Thought you might like an update," the ranger said, settling into the visitor's chair. "We sent a team to your cabin. This morning, they found clear evidence of the bear. Tracks, some fur caught on the tree where you took refuge. Based on the prints, we're estimating a male black bear, about 3 years old and 230 to 250 pounds. Pretty much aligns with your description." Carl nodded, a vivid image of the bear's face just inches from his own flashing through his mind. "Did they find it?" "No," Ranger Harding said. "We set up some trail cameras and a trap, but my guess is the bear has moved on. The encounter probably scared it as much as it scared you. Black bears typically avoid areas where they've had negative experiences with humans. So you're not going to, put it down?" Carl asked, surprised by his own concern for the animal that had caused him such trauma. Ranger Harding studied him for a moment. Protocol would suggest removal of a bear that's attacked a human, but in this case it sounds like a defensive reaction to being startled, not predatory behavior. And without being able to identify the specific bear, with absolute certainty, we'd risk removing the wrong animal. He leaned forward slightly. "Between you and me, unless this bear causes further problems, we'll likely just monitor the area more closely for a while. But I do need to ask, would you be willing to install some additional bear deterrents at your cabin? Motion activated. Lights, proper food storage, that sort of thing? Might help prevent future incidents, not just for you, but for the bear's sake too. Once they start associating human areas with food or shelter, it rarely ends well for them." "Yeah, of course," Carl agreed readily. "Already planning on it." "Good man," Ranger Harding said with an approving nod. "Your cabin's in good shape. By the way, we secured it before leaving, and—" he reached into his pocket. "We brought your cell phone charger. Figured you might need it." The thoughtful gesture took Carl by surprise. "Thanks," he said, genuinely touched by the consideration. "That's really thoughtful." Ranger Harding smiled. "Well, we look out for each other out here, don't we? Oh, and fair warning, there's a reporter from the Roseburg News Review who's been asking questions about the attack. Wildlife encounters make for popular local news, especially this close to town. Just thought you should know." Carl groaned. "Seriously, I'd rather not be the local wildlife headline if it's all the same." "You don't have to talk to them," Ranger Harding assured him. "In fact, it might be better if you didn't until the official report is complete. I can run interference if anyone shows up here." "Appreciate that," Carl said, the thought of becoming a local news story adding a new layer of discomfort to his situation. Despite Ranger Harding's offer, the journalist in question, a young woman named Jessica Chen from the News Review, managed to gain access to Carl's room the following morning, arriving with a small potted plant and an eager expression that immediately set Carl on edge. "Mr. Dobbs, I'm Jessica Chen from the News Review," she introduced herself, setting the plant on his bedside table without waiting for an invitation. "I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your encounter with the bear. It's not often we get wildlife attacks this close to Roseburg." Carl sighed, contemplating a firm refusal, but something in the reporter's earnest expression softened his resolve. "I'm not sure what else there is to say beyond what I've told the rangers and deputies," he said. "I was taking a nap. A bear showed up. It attacked me when I tried to get away. Now I'm here." Jessica pulled out a small digital recorder. "Do you mind if I record our conversation? And perhaps take a photo for the article?" "No photos," Carl said firmly, "and I reserve the right to tell you when we're done." She nodded agreement, switching on the recorder. What followed was a more detailed retelling of the encounter, with Jessica asking questions that ranged from relevant to oddly tangential. Was he afraid of bears before this incident? Did he think climate change was driving bears closer to human habitation? Would he continue to use his cabin after recovering? Some questions Carl answered thoughtfully, others he deflected or simply declined to address. Throughout the interview, he found himself strangely protective of the bear, emphasizing that the animal had likely been as startled as he was, and that the attack had occurred only after he ran. "It was just being a bear," he concluded. "Doing what bears do. I was the one out of place in a way." Jessica's expression suggested that his perspective wasn't quite matching the dramatic narrative she'd envisioned. "But surely you must feel some anger toward the animal. It's left you with serious injuries, potentially months of recovery." Carl shook his head. "Honestly, I respect it more than anything. It wasn't malicious, it was just surviving, following instincts, same as I was when I ran and when I climbed that tree." "So you don't support the efforts to locate and remove the bear?" "I didn't say that," Carl clarified. "If it's showing a pattern of aggression toward humans, that's different. But from what the ranger told me, that doesn't seem to be the case. One incident doesn't make a man-eater." Jessica made a note, then asked, "Do you have any evidence of the encounter? Photos of your injuries or perhaps of the bear itself?" Carl almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "Yeah, I stopped to take selfies while being chased by a bear," he said dryly. "No, I don't have photos, just these." He gestured to his cast and the bandages visible beneath his hospital gown, "and whatever scars I end up with." The interview continued for another 10 minutes before Carl began to tire. Noting his fading energy, Jessica thanked him for his time, promised to let him review quotes before publication, and left him with her business card. True to her word, Jessica emailed a draft of the article the next day to Carl's phone. The piece was headlined, "Local Mechanic Survives Bear Attack in Umpqua National Forest," and while it accurately reported the basic facts, Carl found himself cringing at phrases like terrifying encounter, vicious attack, and narrowly escaped with his life. His own quotes were accurate, but seemed cherry-picked to maximize drama, with his more nuanced comments about the bear's natural behavior largely omitted. Carl sent a brief response, suggesting some modifications to tone down the sensationalism, but held little hope that his suggestions would be implemented. Sure enough, when the article appeared in the news review 2 days later, it retained most of the dramatic language, though Jessica had included a paragraph mentioning Carl's surprisingly philosophical attitude toward the bear. By then, Carl had more immediate concerns. His doctors had determined he was stable enough for discharge, provided he had appropriate support at home. After numerous phone calls, he'd arranged for a former employee, Mitch, to stay at his house for the first week and help with basic needs. Home health aides would visit regularly after that, and a ramp was being installed at his front door to accommodate the wheelchair he'd use until cleared for weight-bearing on his injured ankle. The discharge process itself was a flurry of paperwork, instructions, prescriptions, and appointments. A physical therapist demonstrated exercises Carl should perform to maintain muscle tone in his uninjured limbs and the upper portion of his injured leg. A nurse provided detailed wound care instructions for the lacerations on his calf, which were healing well, but still required regular cleaning and dressing changes. Dr. Khoury made a final visit to explain the follow-up schedule for his ankle and to emphasize the importance of keeping weight completely off the injured joint for at least 6 weeks. "The bones will heal," Dr. Khoury assured him, "but rushing the process by bearing weight too soon could cause permanent damage to the joint structure. I know it's frustrating, but patience is essential here." 5 days after limping into the emergency room, Carl found himself being wheeled out to Mitch's waiting pickup truck, his possessions in a hospital-provided plastic bag, his left leg encased in a bulky cast, and a prescription for pain medication in his pocket. The transition from hospital to home proved more challenging than anticipated, even with Mitch's assistance. Carl's small ranch-style house, perfectly adequate when he was mobile, revealed itself to be a minefield of obstacles when navigated by wheelchair. Doorways just narrow enough to scrape knuckles, furniture arrangements that created dead ends, bathroom facilities that assumed a level of mobility he no longer possessed. The first few days at home established a frustrating new normal, struggling with basic self-care, experiencing waves of pain that the prescribed medication only partially addressed, and battling the psychological impact of sudden dependence. Mitch proved an unexpectedly patient caretaker, adapting Carl's home to better accommodate his limitations and fielding the steady stream of well-wishers who began appearing once word of his injuries spread through the community. News of the bear attack had indeed made Carl something of a local celebrity. Neighbors he barely knew arrived with casseroles and offers of assistance. Regular customers from his auto shop stopped by with awkward expressions of sympathy and thinly veiled curiosity about the details of the encounter. The owner of the parts supplier Carl used for his business sent a fruit basket with a card reading, "Very glad you're okay," a pun that might have been amusing under different circumstances, but now just felt forced. By the end of the first week, Carl was thoroughly tired of retelling the story, answering the same questions and reassuring visitors that yes, he was recovering, and no, he wasn't traumatized beyond repair. When Jessica Chen called requesting a follow-up interview about his recovery process, he politely but firmly declined. "Nothing personal," he told her, "but I'm ready to be known as something other than the guy who got attacked by a bear." Mitch returned to his own life after the first week, replaced by a rotation of home health aides who helped with medical needs and basic household tasks. Carl's forced inactivity left him with abundant time to consider next steps for both his business and his cabin in the forest. His shop was being temporarily managed by a competitor from across town, an arrangement that preserved client relationships but generated minimal income. The cabin remained as he'd left it, secured by Ranger Harding's team, but otherwise untouched since the attack. 2 weeks into his recovery, Carl received another visit from Ranger Harding, who arrived with a folder of paperwork and a serious expression. "Thought you might like to know," the ranger said after they'd exchanged greetings. "We've taken down the trap at your cabin. No sign of the bear returning to the area, and the trail cameras haven't captured any unusual bear activity, just the usual wildlife, deer, raccoons, and occasional cougar passing through." "That's good," Carl said, feeling a sense of relief that surprised him. "So you're not pursuing the bear anymore?" "Not actively," Ranger Harding confirmed. "Given the defensive nature of the encounter and the lack of additional incidents, we've classified this as a Level 2 human-wildlife conflict. Serious, but not indicating a particularly dangerous individual animal. We'll maintain increased patrols in the area through the season, but otherwise standard protocols apply." He handed Carl a pamphlet titled "Living with Bears: Safety Guidelines for Forest Homeowners." "I brought some information about bear deterrence you might consider installing when you're back on your feet." Ranger Harding continued, "Motion-activated lights, proper food storage solutions, that sort of thing. These measures protect both you and the bears. Animals that become habituated to human areas often end up having to be relocated or euthanized." "I'll definitely look into it," Carl promised, accepting the materials. "To be honest, I've been wondering if I should sell the cabin. Not sure I'll feel the same about it now." Ranger Harding nodded understandingly. "That's a natural reaction, but in my experience, most people eventually move past the fear. The forest is still the same place you enjoyed before. This was an unusual encounter, not a new normal." The conversation shifted to Carl's recovery progress and the practical challenges he was facing. Before leaving, Ranger Harding mentioned that the official report on the incident was complete and that Carl could request a copy if he wished. "Thanks for keeping me updated," Carl said as the ranger prepared to leave. "Most people would have just filed their report and moved on." Ranger Harding smiled. "Part of the job is helping people understand and coexist with wildlife, even after negative encounters. Besides, I grew up around here. My dad used to get his truck fixed at your shop." The revelation that he'd serviced the ranger's family vehicles created an unexpected connection, a reminder that the community Carl had sometimes held at arm's length was nevertheless interconnected in ways he hadn't fully appreciated. As his physical recovery progressed, the lacerations on his calf healing to puckered pink scars, the swelling in his ankle gradually subsiding within the confines of the cast, Carl found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of the bear. He searched online for information about black bear behavior, habitat requirements, and typical movement patterns. He read accounts of other bear encounters, some with far worse outcomes than his own. He even found himself defending the animal. In conversations with visitors who expressed hopes that the dangerous beast had been taken care of, "It was just being a bear," became his standard response to such comments. "I was in its home," not the other way around. 1 month after the attack, Carl had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Khoury, who took new x-rays and pronounced himself satisfied with the healing process. "The bones are knitting nicely," he said, examining the images on a computer screen. The soft tissue damage is also recovering well, though there will be permanent scarring, both external and internal. You're still looking at another 2 to 3 weeks in the cast, but I'm optimistic about your long-term prognosis. What about driving? Carl asked. And work? I need to get back to my shop. Dr. Curie considered the question. Driving with an automatic transmission might be possible once we transition to a walking boot, assuming you use your right foot for pedals. As for work, light duty in about 2 weeks perhaps, but you need to understand that full recovery will take time. Rushing back to physically demanding tasks could set you back significantly. Carl nodded, accepting but not entirely satisfied with the assessment. As frustrating as his limitations were, he recognized the necessity of following medical advice. The long inactive days had given him ample time to reflect on how little margin for error his previous lifestyle had contained. No employees to cover extended absence, minimal savings to cushion financial shock, a social circle too limited to provide sustained support during crisis. 6 weeks post-attack, Carl's cast was removed and replaced with a walking boot, granting him a measure of independence he'd sorely missed. Though still reliant on crutches and limited in what he could safely do, the ability to move through his own home without the wheelchair represented a significant milestone in his recovery. With his newfound mobility, Carl decided it was time to revisit his cabin. Mitch agreed to drive him up for the day, an offer Carl accepted with more trepidation than he cared to admit. As the pickup truck turned onto the familiar Forest Service road, Carl found himself scanning the tree line with heightened vigilance, his body tensing at each shadow or movement among the undergrowth. "You sure about this?" Mitch asked, noting Carl's white-knuckled grip on the door handle. "We can turn around, come back another time." "No," Carl said firmly. "I need to do this. Can't let one bad experience ruin something I've loved for years." The cabin appeared unchanged as they pulled into the clearing. The same weathered cedar siding, the same modest porch, the same surrounding sentinel trees, yet everything felt different through the lens of Carl's recent experience. The forest that had once represented peaceful solitude now seemed to harbor hidden threats. The dappled shadows that had once been soothing now concealed potential dangers. With Mitch's assistance, Carl made his way to the porch, each crutch-assisted step a deliberate act of reclamation. He paused at the top step, his gaze drawn to the spot where the hammock had hung between 2 Douglas firs, the epicenter of an encounter that had altered his life's trajectory. The hammock itself was gone, presumably removed by Ranger Harding's team when they secured the cabin. "It happened right there," Carl said quietly. "I was just taking a nap, like I'd done 100 times before." Mitch, who had heard the story in detail during his week as Carl's caretaker, simply nodded, allowing space for whatever process his friend needed to work through. Inside, the cabin had acquired a musty, disused smell, but was otherwise exactly as Carl had left it during his painful exit nearly 2 months earlier. Dust had settled on surfaces, and a mouse had clearly explored the kitchen cabinets, but the space remained fundamentally his, a refuge he had created and maintained for 7 years of weekends and holidays. Carl moved through the small rooms slowly, reacquainting himself with the space, testing whether the emotional connection that had made this place special could survive the overlay of trauma. On the bathroom wall, the first aid kit hung partially open, items hastily replaced after his emergency self-treatment. In the bedroom, the bedding remained rumpled from his restless night after the attack. "You know," Carl said as Mitch helped him onto the small couch in the main room, "I'm not sure I'd have made it if the bear had caught me out here in the open. That tree probably saved my life, giving me a way to get out of reach." "Lucky it wasn't a grizzly," Mitch observed. "They can climb too, I think." "No grizzlies in Oregon, not anymore," Carl replied, the research he'd done during his convalescence surfacing automatically. "Just black bears, and they usually avoid people when they can." The day passed quietly as Carl and Mitch addressed basic maintenance needs, airing out the musty interior, checking for any damage or intrusions, confirming that utilities were functioning properly. Carl found himself repeatedly drawn to the window overlooking the spot where the attack had occurred, his mind replaying the sequence of events with a clarity that was both disturbing and somehow necessary. As evening approached, bringing with it longer shadows and increased wildlife activity, Carl made his decision. "I'm keeping the place," he told Mitch as they prepared to leave, "but I'm going to make some changes. On the drive back to Roseburg, Carl outlined his plans: motion-activated security lights around the perimeter, a proper bear-resistant food storage system, an emergency satellite phone for reliable communication, small accommodations to the reality of sharing space with wildlife, not a surrender to fear. "And no more hammock naps?" Mitch asked with a hint of a smile. Carl laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuineness. "Oh, I wouldn't go that far. But maybe I'll set up the hammock where I can see what's coming. And definitely no more snoring loud enough to attract wildlife." In the weeks that followed, Carl gradually increased his work hours at the shop, starting with paperwork and customer consultations, then progressing to lighter mechanical tasks as his recovery allowed. The financial hit had been substantial, but not catastrophic, and he began implementing changes there too, hiring a part-time assistant, creating more robust emergency protocols, building stronger relationships with neighboring businesses. 3 months after the attack, with autumn painting the Umpqua National Forest in rust and gold, Carl returned to his cabin for an overnight stay. He'd made good on his promised security upgrades, installing motion-activated lights that could detect movement at the forest's edge, replacing the screen door with a more substantial model, and subscribing to a satellite communication service. That provided reliable emergency contact even in remote areas. He arrived in late afternoon, allowing plenty of time to settle in before darkness fell. The weather was crisp but clear, a perfect early October day. Carl moved through his arrival routine with practiced efficiency, despite the slight limp that still characterized his gait, storing food in the new bear-resistant container, checking the solar-powered security lights, ensuring the satellite phone was functional. Only when these precautions were complete did he step out onto the porch, scanning the forest edge with deliberate calm. The same trees stood in silent witness, the same river murmured in the distance, the same wind whispered through branches beginning to shed their summer foliage. It was, in all meaningful ways, the same forest he had always loved. Carl descended the porch steps and walked to the spot where the hammock had once hung. He'd brought a new one, sturdier with a support structure that allowed it to be set up with better visibility of the surrounding area, but hadn't yet decided whether to install it. For now, he simply stood in the space, acknowledging the fear that still lingered but refusing to be governed by it. A movement at the forest edge caught his attention, not a bear this time but a doe and the same fawn, now much larger, that he had observed after the attack. They paused at the clearing's periphery, the doe's ears flicking alertly as she assessed potential threats. Finding none significant enough to deter her, she led her offspring into the open area, beginning to browse on the vegetation that had flourished during the cabin's months of disuse. Carl watched them without moving, appreciating the graceful efficiency of their movements, the clear communication between mother and offspring, the perfect adaptation to their environment. Like the bear, they were simply being what they were, following instincts honed by millennia of evolution in these forests. As twilight deepened toward evening, Carl returned to the cabin, closing the more substantial door behind him with a satisfying solidity. He prepared a simple meal on the propane stove, organized his few supplies for the overnight stay, and settled into the armchair with a book he'd been meaning to read for months. The motion sensor lights activated occasionally as wildlife moved through the clearing, nothing large or concerning, just the regular nocturnal activities of the forest community. Carl slept lightly that night, waking at unfamiliar sounds, but the panic that had characterized his memories of the attack remained muted, manageable. By morning, as sunlight filtered through the bedroom window and birdsong announced the beginning of a new day, he felt a tentative sense of reclamation, of the cabin, of the forest, of a part of himself that had been temporarily lost to trauma. While making coffee, Carl noticed movement through the kitchen window, significant enough to activate the security lights despite the brightening dawn. He moved to the window, coffee mug forgotten in his hand, and felt his breath catch in his throat. Oh, black bear, possibly the same individual that had attacked him, though it was impossible to be certain, stood at the edge of the clearing. It was on all fours, head slightly raised as it sampled the air, clearly detecting the human scent emanating from the cabin. For a long moment, bear and human regarded each other across the intervening space. The bear with instinctive wariness, Carl with a complex mixture of fear, respect, and a strange sense of completion. Then, with a dismissive huff that seemed to say this territory was not worth the potential conflict, the bear turned and ambled back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as silently as it had appeared. Carl watched the spot where it had vanished for several minutes, aware of his elevated heart rate, but also of the absence of panic, of the difference between healthy respect and debilitating fear. "Be well out there," he said quietly to the departed animal, lifting his coffee mug in a small salute before turning back to the familiar comfort of his reclaimed sanctuary. Nearly half a year after the attack, the physical evidence of Carl's encounter had faded to manageable proportions, the scars on his calf visible but no longer angry and red, his gait mostly normal, though his ankle still protested changes in weather and excessive activity. The psychological impact lingered in more subtle ways: an increased vigilance in outdoor settings, occasional dreams of pursuit, a heightened awareness of vulnerability in wild spaces. But these remnants existed alongside positive changes: a deeper appreciation for the community that had supported him, a more balanced approach to work and leisure, a richer understanding of the complex relationship between humans and the wilderness they both cultivate and fear. The attack had been a single event, significant, life-altering in many ways, but ultimately just one experience in a continuing narrative. In the broader world beyond Carl's personal recovery, the bear attack had created barely a ripple. Jessica, Chen's article in the news review, had generated brief local interest, a few days of conversation at Roseburg coffee shops and diners. Ranger Harding had filed his report, the statistics of the encounter absorbed into annual wildlife management data. The medical professionals who had treated Carl moved on to other patients with other stories. Even the bear itself, whether the same individual still traversed the forests around Carl's cabin or had moved to more remote territories, continued its bearish existence, untroubled by human concepts of blame or responsibility, simply following the ancient imperatives of survival. In a world increasingly shaped by human presence, Carl installed the new hammock eventually, positioning it where he could maintain awareness of his surroundings while still enjoying the simple pleasure of an afternoon nap in dappled sunlight. He added bear bells to his hiking equipment, made noise when moving through thick underbrush, and became diligent about proper food storage, reasonable precautions that acknowledged risk without surrendering to fear. And sometimes, sitting on his cabin porch as evening settled over the forest, he would raise his coffee mug to the deepening shadows among the trees, a quiet acknowledgement of shared territory, mutual respect, and the wild heart that continued to beat beneath the veneer of civilization in the forest and in himself.